The pitchfork clattered to the barn floor as Hank Weatherby's weathered hands trembled around the bundle of rags that shouldn't have been breathing. Beneath the moth-eaten quilt, a pair of startling violet eyes stared up at him, eyes that belonged to a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, her dark hair matted with straw and tears streaking through the dirt on her hollow cheeks. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty barn that had seen too many lonely years since his beloved Cordelia passed. The girl flinched at his words, pressing herself deeper into the corner where she'd made her nest. Among the old horse blankets, her lips moved soundlessly, forming words that never came, and Hank realized with a jolt that she was muter, perhaps just too frightened to speak. "Easy now, little sparrow," he murmured, setting down the pitchfork, and crouching to her level. "I'm not going to hurt you." In the amber light filtering through the barn's weathered boards, he could see she was far too thin, her collarbone sharp beneath the torn fabric of what had once been a blue dress. Her feet were bare and cut, suggesting she'd traveled far too. Find this refuge in his barn, the girl Grace. He would later learn when she finally wrote her name in the dirt, watched him with the wariness of a wild creature as he slowly extended his hand. When she didn't pull away, he gently touched her forehead, feeling the fever that burned beneath her pale skin. "You're sick, child," he said, his heart clenching with a familiar ache. He'd lost 2 daughters of his own to scarlet fever 20 years past, and Cordelia to consumption just 5 winters ago. This abandoned girl stirred something in his chest he'd thought buried with his family. As if sensing his thoughts, Grace reached out with a trembling hand and touched the worn gold band still circling his finger. Her eyes held a wisdom too deep for her years, as if she understood loss in ways that shouldn't touch someone so young. Hank made his decision in that moment.
Dad!
Standing slowly and shrugging off his wool coat. "Come on then, Grace. Let's get you inside where it's warm." She shrank back, shaking her head frantically, pointing toward the road that led to the village of Millbrook Hollow. Even without words, he understood she was running from something, or someone. "Nobody's going to find you here," he promised, draping his coat around her shoulders. "This old farm's been forgotten by most folks since Cordelia died. It's just you and me and the ghosts now." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she allowed him to help her stand on unsteady legs. As they walked toward the farmhouse, the autumn wind whipping around them, Hank couldn't know that this girl would change everything, that her silence would teach him to listen. Her brokenness would show him how to heal, and her love would prove that second chances could bloom, even in the loneliest hearts. The first snowflake of winter touched Grace's upturned face as they reached the porch, and Hank saw her smile for the first time, a expression so radiant it made him believe in miracles again. 3 weeks had passed since Hank found Grace in his barn, and the girl had transformed his empty house into something that felt like home again. She moved through the rooms like a gentle spirit, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors.
"Oh, see me?"
To anticipate his needs before he voiced them, though she remained mute. Grace communicated through gestures and expressions that spoke volumes. She'd point to the old rocking chair by the fireplace where Cordelia used to sit, then to herself, asking permission. When Hank nodded, she'd settle there with her mending, her fingers working magic on his threadbare shirts and torn socks. "You don't have to earn your keep, child," he told her one evening, as she stirred a pot of stew that smelled better than anything he'd tasted in years. "This is your home now, for as long as you need it." Grace turned from the stove, her violet eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She pressed her hand to her heart, then pointed to him, a gesture he'd come to understand meant gratitude deeper than words could express. The nightmares came every night. Hank would wake to muffled whimpers from the small room upstairs that had once belonged to his daughter Mercy. He'd find Grace huddled in the corner, her body rigid with terror, eyes wide and unseeing. The first few times, he'd simply sat beside her until the fear passed. "But tonight was different, Grace," he whispered, settling on the floor beside her. "Whatever happened before, whoever hurt you, they can't reach you here." She turned to him then, and in the moonlight streaming through the window, he saw something break open in her expression. Her lips parted, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, She reached for the slate he'd given her and wrote in shaky letters, "They killed Papa. Made me watch." Hank's blood ran cold. "Who, child? Who did this?" "The Brennan boys," said Papa owed money. Her hand shook as she wrote, "Burned our cabin." I ran. The Brennan family, Hank knew them well. Jasper Brennan and his 3 sons ran the roughest saloon in the next county over, and rumors of their cruelty had reached even quiet Millbrook Hollow. That this gentle girl had escaped them seemed nothing short of divine intervention. "You're safe now," he promised, gathering her into his arms like he used to hold his own daughters. "I'll die before I let anyone hurt you again." Grace melted against him, her thin frame shaking with silent sobs. For the first time since Cordelia's death, Hank felt purpose flow through his veins, not just the purpose of protection, but of love. This broken girl was healing something in him he hadn't even realized was wounded. As dawn approached, Grace finally slept peacefully in his arms, and Hank made a silent vow to the wife he'd lost and the daughters he'd buried. This child would know safety, would know love, would know what it meant to have a future bright with possibility. Outside, the first snows of winter began to fall, blanketing the farm in pristine white, a clean slate, just like the one Grace wrote upon. And somewhere in the depths of his heart, Hank began to believe that healing could come to anyone willing to open their doors to Grace. Winter settled over Millbrook Hollow like a soft quilt, and with it came a rhythm to life at the Weatherby farm that neither Hank nor Grace had expected. The girl who had arrived as a frightened sparrow was slowly transforming into something beautiful and strong, her violet eyes regaining their sparkle as trust took root in her heart. Hank discovered that Grace had an almost supernatural gift with animals. The old milk cow Bessie, who had been ornery and difficult since Cordelia's death, now followed Grace around the barn like a devoted puppy. The chickens actually laid more eggs when Grace collected them, and even the wild horses that sometimes wandered onto his property would approach her without fear. "I swear you could charm a rattlesnake into singing hymns." Hank chuckled one morning as he watched her coax an injured fox out of its hiding place beneath the porch. Grace smiled at expression. That came more frequently and carefully examined the fox's wounded paw. With gentle touches and soft humming sounds that weren't quite words but carried all the comfort of a lullaby, she cleaned and bandaged the injury. The fox, which should have bitten or fled, simply gazed at her with amber eyes full of trust. As the weeks passed, Hank found himself looking forward to their quiet evenings by the fire. Grace would sit in Cordelia's old rocking chair, working on her latest project she'd taken to making beautiful quilts from fabric scraps. Her needlework so precise it seemed like art. He'd read aloud from books of poetry or adventure stories, watching her face light up at particularly exciting passages. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside, Grace suddenly rose from her chair and disappeared upstairs. She returned carrying an old violin case, its leather cracked with age. "That was Mercy's," Hank said softly, recognizing the instrument his daughter had loved. "Found it in your room, did you?" Grace nodded and carefully lifted the violin from its case. She tucked it beneath her chin with the practiced ease of someone who had played before and drew the bow across the strings. The melody that filled the room was heartbreakingly beautiful, sad, sweet song that seemed to carry all the grief and hope in the world. Tears streamed down Hank's cheeks as he listened. The music spoke of loss and longing, but also of love that transcended death, of connections that couldn't be severed by time or tragedy. Grace finished. She looked at him with understanding in her eyes. "Your papa taught you to play," he said, and she nodded. "He'd be proud of the woman you're becoming." Grace set down the violin and came to him, kneeling beside his chair. She took his weathered hands in her small ones and pressed them to her heart, then pointed to the photograph of Cordelia on the mantelpiece. She was telling him that love lived. On that, the connections they'd lost weren't truly gone, but lived within the bonds they formed with others. That night, for the first time since Cordelia's death, Hank felt truly at peace. This girl who had come to him broken and voiceless was teaching him profound truths about healing and hope. She was becoming more than the daughter he'd lost. She was becoming exactly who she was meant to be. and who he was meant to protect and cherish. As he lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, Hank whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had led Grace to his barn. She was no longer just a refugee seeking shelter, she was family. And he would spend whatever time he had left ensuring she knew the depth of a father's love. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and awakening something dangerous along with the wildflowers. Hank noticed the change first in Grace's demeanor. She'd grown skittish again, jumping at unexpected sounds and glancing nervously toward the road whenever she worked in the garden. It was while he was repairing a fence post that he saw them three riders on the hill overlooking his property. Even from a distance, he could make out their distinctive silhouettes. Jasper Brennan and two of his sons, scanning the valley like wolves searching for prey. Hank's blood chilled. He'd hoped Grace's trail had gone cold over the winter, that the Brennans had given up their hunt. But men like that didn't forget, especially when it came to loose ends that might testify against them. He found Grace in the kitchen, her face pale as moonlight, her hands shaking as she tried to knead bread dough. She'd seen them too. "Grace," he said gently, taking the dough from her trembling fingers. "Look at me, child." Violet eyes met his, wide with the same terror he'd seen that first night in the barn. "I won't let them take you," he promised, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. "But I need you to trust me."
Can you do that?
She nodded, though her whole body quaked like a leaf in a storm. Hank moved with purpose, retrieving his old cavalry rifle from above the fireplace and checking the ammunition. 25 years had passed since he'd carried this weapon in service, but his hands remembered the weight, the balance, the deadly promise it represented. "There's a root cellar beneath the pantry," he told Grace, showing her the hidden door. "If shooting starts, you get down there and you stay hidden until I come for you. No matter what you hear, you don't come up. Understand?" Grace grabbed his sleeve, shaking her head frantically. She pointed to herself, then to him, making it clear she wouldn't abandon him. "This isn't your fight anymore," Hank said firmly.
Thanks.
"Mine now. You're my daughter in every way that matters, and a man protects his family." The word daughter seemed to break something open in Grace. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and retreated to the cellar as he'd asked. The Brennans came just after sunset, their horses' hooves thundering across the packed earth of his yard. Jasper Brennan dismounted with the swagger of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence. His sons, Colt and Ridge, flanked him like trained attack dogs. "Weatherby," Jasper called out, his voice carrying across the evening air. "No, you've got something that belongs to us." Hank stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled in his arms. "Only thing on this property belongs to me or my daughter, your daughter." Jasper laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That little witness hiding in your house ain't your blood. She's the only one who can tie us to her daddy's unfortunate accident. She's under my protection now," Hank replied evenly. "And I don't take kindly to uninvited guests making demands on my land." Colt Brennan spat into the dirt. "Old man's got sand, I'll give him that. But sand won't stop bullets." "Maybe not," Hank agreed, raising his rifle with practiced precision. "But it'll slow them down long enough for me to send you boys to meet your maker." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 against 1 in the fading light. But Hank had something they didn't love worth dying for, and a daughter worth protecting. That made all the difference in what was about to unfold. The first shot came from Ridge Brennan, the youngest of the brothers, his patience snapping like a dry twig. The bullet splintered the porch rail inches from Hank's shoulder, but the old soldier had already moved, rolling behind the thick wooden post that supported the roof overhang. "Fool boy," Jasper roared at his son. "We needed her alive." But it was too late for restraint. Once return shot took Ridge clean off his horse. The young man's scream cut short as he hit the ground hard. The cavalry rifle's familiar kick against his shoulder awakened instincts Hank thought he'd buried with his uniform. Colt Brennan charged his horse toward the porch, pistol blazing. Hank dove through the doorway as bullets shattered the windows behind him, glass raining down like deadly snow. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from the terrible clarity that came with mortal combat. "Grace," he called out, "stay down no matter what." From the cellar came a faint tapping her way of telling him she'd heard and obeyed. Jasper had dismounted and was circling toward the back of the house. A Colt kept Hank pinned down with covering fire. These weren't random killers. They moved with the coordination of men who'd done this before. Hank crawled to the kitchen window and caught sight of Jasper's shadow moving along the barn wall. The older Brennan was trying to flank him, probably planning to fire the house and smoke them out. It was a sound strategy against most men. But Hank hadn't survived 3 years of cavalry charges to die in his own kitchen. He slipped out the back door, using the chicken coop for cover. The hens squawked and scattered as he moved through their pen. But the noise was lost in the chaos of Colt's continued shooting. Hank reached the barn just as Jasper was striking a match. "Planning to burn down my life's work?" Hank asked conversationally. Jasper spun, his gun half drawn, but Hank's rifle was already leveled at his chest. "Where is she?" Jasper demanded, his weathered face twisted with rage. "That girl's testimony could hang us all." "She's not testifying against anyone," Hank replied. "She's living her life, which is more than you deserve to do." "You don't understand." Jasper snarled. "We ain't the only ones looking for her. There's others men who don't take kindly to witnesses." Confession hit Hank like a physical blow. Grace wasn't just running from her father's killers, she was fleeing an entire network of criminals who saw her silence as their only guarantee of safety. "Then I guess I'll have to kill them all," Hank said simply. Jasper laughed bitterly. "You're one old man? You can't protect her forever." "Maybe not forever," Hank agreed, "but I can protect her today." The rifle's roar echoed across the valley, and Jasper Brennan crumpled to the barn floor. Hank turned to face Colt, who had finally realized his father's shooting had stopped. The young man appeared around the corner of the house, his face a mask of grief and rage. "You killed them," he whispered. "You killed my family." "They killed themselves when they chose to threaten mine," Hank replied. Colt raised his pistol with shaking hands, but grief had made him sloppy. Hank's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but not killing him.
Out.
The pistol flew from his grasp and he collapsed against the porch steps. "This ends now," Hank said, standing over the wounded man. "You ride out of here, and you spread the word to anyone comes looking for Grace. They'll find me waiting, and I don't miss twice." Colt nodded frantically, clutching his wounded shoulder. I'll tell everyone to stay away." As the last, Brennan limped to his horse and rode into the darkness. Hank felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The fierce satisfaction of a battle won in defense of family. Grace was safe, and he had proven to himself as much as to any potential threats. He would die before allowing harm to come to the daughter of his heart. In the days following the confrontation with the Brennans, a profound quiet settled. Over the farm, not the hollow silence of loneliness, but the deep peace that comes after a storm has passed. Grace moved through the house with a new lightness in her step, though Hank caught her watching him with something that looked like wonder in her violet eyes. It was while they sat together on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, that Grace suddenly stood and disappeared into the house. She returned carrying her slate and chalk, her expression more serious than he'd seen in weeks. "Why did you fight for me?" she wrote, her letters careful and precise. "Because you're my daughter," Hank replied without hesitation. "Blood doesn't make family. Love does." Grace shook her head, erasing the slate with her sleeve. "I mean, why really? You could have let them take me. Would have been safer for you," Hank studied her face in the fading light, seeing not the frightened waif who'd hidden in his barn, but a young woman on the cusp of understanding profound truths about human nature. "When I was your age," he said slowly, "I thought love was something that happened to you like lightning or illness, something beyond your control that either blessed you or passed you by." He paused, watching a hawk circle overhead its wings, catching the last rays of sunlight. "But loving you, Grace, taught me something different. Love isn't something that happens to you, it's something you choose to do every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she wrote again, "I chose to love you too. From that first night when you gave me your coat, I know you did, little sparrow. I felt it." She set down the slate and moved closer to him on the swing, resting her head against his shoulder. For a long moment, they simply existed in that perfect understanding, that comes between people who have chosen each other completely. Then Grace lifted her head and opened her mouth. For the first time since he'd known her, sound emerged. Words, yet but a soft humming that grew stronger and more confident as she realized she could make it. "Grace," Hank whispered, hardly daring to breathe. She looked at him with eyes bright with wonder and determination. Her lips parted, and in a voice rusty from disuse, but clear as spring water, she spoke her first words in his presence. "Thank you, ... Papa." The word hit him like a physical force. Papa, not Hank, not Mr. Weatherby. But the title that meant everything, the acknowledgement that their bond went deeper than law or blood or circumstance. "Grace," he managed, his own voice thick with emotion. "You can speak," she nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I was so scared for so long. Scared that if I made any sound, they would find me. But watching you fight for me, I realized I wasn't hiding anymore. I was home." He gathered her into his arms. This miraculous daughter who had found her voice through love and safety. The girl who had arrived broken and silent was becoming a woman of strength and courage. And he had been privileged to witness, to participate in her transformation. "I love you, Papa," Grace whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me a future." As the stars appeared overhead, Hank held his daughter and marveled at the way Grace, both the girl and the concept, had transformed his life. He had thought his story was ending when Cordelia died, but it had only been pausing, waiting for the right moment to begin a new chapter filled with possibility and hope. The future stretched ahead of them now, bright with promise. 2 years later, Grace Weatherby stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse that had become her sanctuary, wearing her mother's Cordelia's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame. The ivory silk caught the morning light streaming through windows she'd cleaned until they sparkled. Her dark hair was arranged in elegant waves that framed her face like a painting. "You look like an angel," Hank said from the doorway, his voice thick with pride and bittersweet joy. Grace turned to him, violet eyes bright with happiness tinged with nervousness. In the 2 years since she'd found her voice, she'd blossomed into a young woman of remarkable grace and strength. Though she still preferred quiet conversation to crowds and found her greatest joy in simple, honest work. "Are you sure about this, Papa?" she asked, using the title that never failed to make his heart swell. "Jeremiah's a good man, but he's taken me away from you." Jeremiah Colwood was indeed a good man, a young veterinarian who'd moved to Millbrook Hollow the previous spring and had fallen completely under Grace's spell. Hank had watched their courtship with the protective eye of a father, but also with the wisdom of a man who understood that love, when genuine, was meant to be shared and celebrated. "He's not taking you anywhere," Hank corrected, adjusting the simple pearl necklace that had been Cordelia's. "He's starting a life with you. There's a difference." Grace smiled, that radiant expression that had first convinced him miracles were possible. "You'll come visit us in the new house?" "Try and keep me away," he chuckled. "Besides, someone has to make sure he treats you right." The new house was only 3 miles down the valley, close enough for daily visits, but far enough for the young couple to build their own traditions. Jeremiah had already promised that Hank would always be welcome, understanding that Grace's love for her adoptive father was not a burden but a blessing, a sign of her capacity for deep, abiding affection as they prepared to leave for the church. Grace caught sight of herself in the hall mirror and paused. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the terrified girl who'd hidden in the barn 3 years ago. This woman stood tall and confident, her eyes clear and bright, her voice ready to speak vows of love without fear. "I've been thinking about something," she said, turning to Hank. "About names. What about them? And Jeremiah and I have children." She blushed prettily. "If we have a son, I'd like to name him Henry, after you." Hank felt his eyes fill with tears he didn't bother to hide. "That would be an honor, daughter." "And if we have a daughter," Grace continued, "I want to name her Cordelia Grace, so that all the love in this family continues." The words were so perfect, so right, that Hank could only nod and gather her into a careful embrace that wouldn't crush her dress at the church, as Hank walked Grace down the aisle toward her future. He caught sight of the faces in the pews, neighbors and friends who had watched. Grace transformed from a mysterious waif into the heart of their small community. She'd started a school for children in the valley, teaching them letters and numbers and the gentle strength that comes from kindness. She'd organized aid for families in need and had become the person others turned to when life grew difficult. The girl who had once been voiceless now spoke for those who couldn't speak for themselves. As he placed her hand in Jeremiah's and stepped back, Hank felt a profound sense of completion. His job as her protector was ending, but his role as her father would continue forever. He'd given Grace a future, but she had given him something equally precious, the knowledge that love could heal any wound. That family was a choice as much as a blessing, and that sometimes the most broken people could become the most whole. Later, at the reception in the church hall, as Grace danced with her new husband, while Hank looked on with pride, he felt a gentle presence beside him. It wasn't supernatural or mystical, just the quiet certainty that Cordelia would approve of the woman their adopted daughter had become. Grace caught his eye over Jeremiah's shoulder and smiled, mouthing the words, "I love you, Papa." Hank nodded back, his heart full to bursting. He'd found her in his barn, broken and afraid, but she'd been the one to save him. Grace had taught him that the future wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you built. Day by day, with love and courage, and the willingness to open your heart to its unexpected miracles. The evening stars were appearing as the celebration continued, and Hank Weatherby knew that whatever tomorrow brought, his greatest adventure, raising Grace, had given meaning to every day he'd been blessed to live.